Alpha King bought young, pregnant Omega sold by her mother and claimed both her and the child. In a snow-blown mining town, a woman heavy with child is pushed onto a crate, her own kin shouting bids to the highest man with coin. Then the saloon doors swing wide and a towering rancher with eyes like winter steps in. One handful of gold ends the bidding, but starts a storm no one sees coming. He doesn't take her to a bunkhouse, he takes her to the altar. By nightfall, she wears his ring and the wind carries them into the mountains. But there's more than snow in the air. A paper, long buried, could save his land. Or see them both driven out. The railroad wants it gone. The law might not protect them. As hoofbeats close in and the church bell tolls, one truth becomes clear. He didn't just buy her safety. He staked his name, his land, and his life on it. Before we begin, I invite you to take a breath. This space is for the quiet believers, the ones who know small kindnesses can ripple into something greater. The bitter wind howled through Silver Hollow's streets, driving sharp needles of snow against Lydia's face as she stumbled into the saloon's back room. Her mother's iron grip on her arm would surely leave bruises, but the physical pain was nothing compared to the shame burning in her chest. The heavy scent of whiskey and unwashed bodies made her stomach turn. Or perhaps it was the baby shifting restlessly within her. Men pressed close, their faces red with drink and greed. Some she recognized from town, the blacksmith's apprentice, a few miners still streaked with coal dust. Others were strangers, their eyes gleaming in the dim lamplight as they sized her up like cattle at auction. Lydia wrapped her arms protectively around her swollen belly, trying to make herself smaller despite her condition. "Well?" Maybelle's voice cracked through the air like a whip. "Who'll start the bidding? She's young, healthy, and can cook and clean proper. Better move quick before the brat comes. She's due in a month." Lydia's cheeks burned with humiliation as the men began calling out offers. A handful of silver coins, a bottle of Kentucky bourbon, crude promises that made her skin crawl. She fixed her gaze on a knot in the wooden floorboards, refusing to look at the faces of those who would buy her like property. The door suddenly burst open with enough force to rattle the glass in its frame. A blast of frigid air swept through the room, momentarily silencing the crowd. Heavy boots crossed the threshold, and Lydia felt the atmosphere shift as the men drew back. She lifted her eyes to see a tall figure filling the doorway, broad-shouldered and imposing in a trail-worn coat dusted with snow. Samuel Greyhawk. She knew him by reputation, a half-Apache rancher who kept mostly to himself up in the high country. His dark eyes took in the scene with dangerous calm. Without a word, he strode forward. The crowd parted before him like water around a stone. He reached into his coat and pulled out a leather pouch that landed on the table with a heavy thud. Gold coins spilled from its mouth, gleaming in the lamplight. "She's mine." His voice was quiet but carried absolute authority. No one dared challenge him. Maybelle's face twisted into something ugly as she snatched up the pouch. "Fine then, take her." She didn't even look at Lydia as she pushed past Samuel and disappeared into the main room of the saloon, already counting her blood money. Samuel turned to Lydia and offered his arm, as proper as any gentleman. "Come with me, Miss Hart." His tone was steady, almost gentle, so different from the rough voices that had been bidding for her moments before. Lydia hesitated only a second before placing her trembling hand on his sleeve. What choice did she have? At least he had shown her basic courtesy, and something in his calm demeanor made her think he wouldn't harm her. He guided her carefully through the silent crowd and out into the storm. The bitter cold hit her like a physical blow, making her gasp. Samuel immediately shrugged out of his coat and wrapped it around her shoulders. The wool was warm from his body and smelled of leather and wood smoke. A sorrel gelding stood patiently at the hitching post, steam rising from its flanks. Samuel helped Lydia mount, making sure she was secure before swinging up behind her. She was acutely aware of his solid presence at her back, his arms bracketing her as he took up the reins. The horse moved forward through the deepening snow, its hooves muffled in the gathering drifts. Lydia was grateful for the warmth of Samuel's coat and the shelter of his body blocking the worst of the wind, but she was still too cold and shocked to speak. Her mind whirled with questions about what would happen to her now. Through the curtain of white, she saw a warm glow ahead, the windows of the small church that served Silver Hollow's faithful. The sight of it sparked a tiny flame of hope in her chest. Whatever Samuel Greyhawk's intentions, at least he was taking her to holy ground first. The gelding's steady gait carried them closer to that beckoning light, away from the shame and degradation of the saloon. Lydia kept her eyes fixed on it like a star, guiding her through the storm, praying that she had not simply traded one form of bondage for another. But for now, she was out of that terrible room, away from her mother's cruelty, and the child within her was safe. She would face whatever came next with the same quiet strength that had gotten her this far. The church's interior offered blessed warmth after the bitter cold outside. Reverend Dunlop looked up from his desk, startled by their sudden entrance. Snow swirled in behind them before Samuel managed to close the heavy wooden door. "Good heavens," the Reverend said, rising from his chair. His kind face creased with concern as he took in Lydia's bedraggled appearance and obvious condition. "Miss Hart? Mr. Greyhawk, what brings you out in such weather?" Samuel kept his steady hand at Lydia's elbow as he guided her closer to the pot-bellied stove. "We need to be married, Reverend, tonight, before anyone gets ideas about taking her back." "Married?" Lydia's voice came out barely above a whisper. She turned to face Samuel, her heart pounding. "But I don't even know you." Samuel moved closer, speaking in a low voice meant only for her ears. "Listen carefully, Miss Hart. Under territorial law, without a husband's protection, you could be claimed by any man who takes a notion. Your mother's already shown she's willing to sell you to the highest bidder." His dark eyes held hers, serious but not unkind. "A legal marriage will keep you safe. Both of you." He glanced meaningfully at her rounded belly. Reverend Dunlop cleared his throat. "This is rather irregular. Are you certain this is what you want, Miss Hart?" Lydia wrapped her arms around herself, mind racing. Samuel was right. She had no protector, no legal standing. Her mother had made it clear she wanted nothing more to do with her pregnant daughter. And this man, whatever his reasons, had already shown her more consideration than anyone else in Silver Hollow. Yes, she said finally. "Yes, I'm certain." Samuel reached into his coat and produced more gold coins, setting them on the Reverend's desk. "For the license," he said simply. The Reverend hesitated a moment longer, then nodded. "We'll need witnesses." He moved to the door and peered out into the storm. "Ah, Mr. Peterson, Mrs. Wilcox, would you step in here a moment?" Two bundled figures hurried through the snow into the church, the baker and the milliner's wife, looking surprised but curious. Reverend Dunlop quickly explained what was needed of them, and they took their places as witnesses, though Mrs. Wilcox couldn't quite hide her disapproving glance at Lydia's condition. The ceremony itself was brief and simple. Lydia stood before the altar in her worn dress, Samuel's borrowed coat still around her shoulders. Her hands trembled slightly as she repeated the traditional vows, but her voice remained steady. Samuel's responses were quiet but firm, his presence beside her solid and reassuring. When it came time for the ring, Samuel produced a plain silver band. Lydia caught her breath as he slipped it onto her finger. It was simple but well made, catching the lamplight with a subtle gleam. She wondered if he'd had it ready, or if this had truly been as unplanned for him as it was for her. After the Reverend pronounced them man and wife, Samuel thanked the witnesses and helped Lydia back into her shawl. "We need supplies before we head home," he explained, leading her back out into the night. "The ride to my homestead is long and the weather's not improving." The mercantile's bell jingled as they entered, the shopkeeper looking up in surprise at customers so late in the evening. Samuel moved efficiently through the store, selecting essential supplies, sacks of flour and beans, coffee, lamp oil, and other staples. Lydia stood near the counter, uncomfortably aware of the shopkeeper's stare fixed on her swollen belly. She pulled her shawl tighter, turning away from his judgment. Samuel seemed to notice her discomfort. He completed his purchases quickly, paying in more gold coins, and had the supplies wrapped against the weather. Within minutes, they were back outside where his sorrel gelding waited patiently. The snow was falling even harder now, as Samuel helped Lydia mount, then secured their supplies behind the saddle. He swung up behind her once more, and she found herself grateful for the warmth of his body as they set out. The church bell tolled faintly in the distance, barely audible through the storm, marking the hour, or perhaps bidding them farewell. They rode in silence through Silver Hollow's empty streets, past darkened buildings and snow-laden trees. Lydia's mind whirled with the evening's events. In the space of a few hours, she had gone from being sold like cattle to being a married woman, riding away with a virtual stranger who was now her husband. Yet somehow, despite the strangeness of it all, she felt safer than she had in months. The town fell away behind them as Samuel guided the horse toward the mountain trail. The sound of the church bell grew fainter and fainter until it was lost entirely in the whisper of falling snow. Lydia didn't look back. There was nothing left for her in Silver Hollow now, only the unknown path ahead, wherever it might lead. The snow grew deeper as they climbed into the mountains, reaching the horse's knees in the drifts. Samuel kept one arm protectively around Lydia, ensuring she stayed secure in the saddle. He had wrapped her in his spare buffalo coat, the thick fur helping to ward off the biting wind that whistled through the pines. "We'll rest here a moment," Samuel said, guiding the horse into a sheltered draw where massive boulders blocked the worst of the wind. He helped Lydia dismount, steadying her as her stiff legs found purchase in the snow. The horse lowered its head gratefully, breathing hard from the climb. Lydia leaned against a snow-dusted boulder, one hand pressed to her aching back. Despite the cold, sweat dampened her hair beneath the coat's heavy collar. Samuel offered her his canteen, and she drank carefully, the water cool against her throat. "My mother's people lived in these mountains," Samuel said quietly, his dark eyes scanning the white-shrouded peaks. "The Apache called this valley home for generations before the settlers came." Lydia's fingers tightened on the canteen. "Your mother was Apache?" He nodded, taking back the canteen. "My father was a white trader who married into the tribe. We had peace here until new settlers pushed us out. A man named Hart led them. Your father, I believe." The shame hit Lydia like a physical blow. She stiffened, words failing her as memories surfaced. Her father's drunken boasts about running off the savages, the cruel pride in his voice when he described claiming the valley. She'd been too young then to understand. But now... I'm sorry," she whispered, though the words felt painfully inadequate. Samuel's expression remained unreadable. Without comment, he helped her back onto the horse, and they continued their slow ascent. They stopped once more to rest in the late afternoon, the winter sun already sliding behind the peaks. When they finally crested a ridge, Lydia saw smoke rising from a stone chimney in the valley below. Samuel's cabin sat nestled against a cliff face, sheltered by towering pines. "Home," Samuel said simply, urging the tired horse down the slope. Night was falling as they reached the cabin. Samuel helped Lydia down, then quickly unsaddled the horse and led it to a nearby lean-to stable. Lydia stood uncertainly by the cabin door, shivering despite the buffalo coat, until Samuel returned to unlock the heavy wooden door. The cabin's interior was dark and cold, but Samuel moved efficiently, lighting oil lanterns that cast a warm glow over the main room. A large wood stove dominated one wall, with a cooking surface on top. Rough-hewn shelves held rows of preserved foods, jars of vegetables, dried meat, and sacks of basic supplies. "The bedroom's through there," Samuel said, gesturing to a doorway covered by a thick wool curtain. "It's small but dry and warm once the stove's going." He built up the fire while Lydia explored the bedroom, just large enough for a narrow bed, a chest for clothes, and a small table with a wash basin. Simple, but clean and solid, like everything else she'd seen of Samuel's home. The wood stove soon radiated welcome heat through the cabin. Samuel moved with practiced ease in the small kitchen area, preparing a stew with dried venison, carrots, and potatoes. The rich smell made Lydia's stomach growl. She couldn't remember the last time she'd eaten. They had just sat down at the rough-hewn table, steam rising from their bowls, when a sharp knock rattled the cabin door. Samuel's head snapped up, his expression instantly alert. Another knock followed, more insistent. Rising slowly, Samuel crossed to the door and opened it, revealing a man in a dark wool coat dusted with snow. He was thin-faced and official-looking, clutching a leather document case to his chest. "Mr. Greyhawk," the man said, his cultured voice carrying a note of satisfaction. "I am Aldous Briggs, representing the Territorial Government and Railroad Commission." Samuel's shoulders tensed, though his voice remained level. "What brings you up here in this weather, Mr. Briggs?" Briggs pulled a folded paper from his case, holding it out like a shield. "I have here a warrant declaring this land to be reservation territory, now designated for railroad development. You are currently occupying this property illegally." "This is my land," Samuel said quietly. "Secured by treaty indeed 15 years ago." "Ah, yes," Briggs smiled thinly. "I was actually present as a junior clerk when that particular treaty was signed. However, new legislation has superseded those old agreements. The railroad's expansion takes precedence now." Lydia watched from the table, her stew forgotten as the two men faced each other in the doorway. Snow swirled in around Briggs's feet, but neither man seemed to notice the cold. The lamplight caught the glint in Briggs's eyes, a look of smug triumph that made her skin crawl. Samuel stood absolutely still, his broad shoulders blocking most of the doorway. When he spoke again, his voice was dangerously quiet. "I suggest you take that warrant and leave, Mr. Briggs. It's a long ride back to town, and the storm's getting worse." "You cannot simply ignore a legal document, Mr. Greyhawk. The law is quite clear on this matter." Briggs thrust the warrant forward again. "This land will be claimed for the railroad's use one way or another." The threat in his words hung in the air between them. Samuel made no move to take the warrant, his hands remaining relaxed at his sides. But Lydia could see the tension in his jaw, the careful way he held himself, like a coiled spring ready to release. The moment stretched, broken only by the howl of wind through the pines and the crackle of the wood stove. Finally, Briggs lowered the warrant, though his satisfied smile remained. "I'll leave this with you to review. Good evening, Mr. Greyhawk." His eyes flicked past Samuel to Lydia at the table, his smile widening slightly. "Mrs. Greyhawk." He placed the warrant on the doorstep, turned, and walked back to where his horse waited in the shadows. Samuel watched until Briggs disappeared into the swirling snow before closing the door. He stood there for a long moment, one hand pressed against the rough wood, before bending to pick up the warrant. Samuel stared at the warrant in his hands, his jaw tight. 60 days, he said, reading from the document. "They're giving us 60 days to prove legal claim to this land, or we must vacate." Lydia huddled deeper into the buffalo coat, still fighting off the chill from their long ride. The warmth from the wood stove hadn't yet reached her bones. "But you said you have a deed." "I do." Samuel's voice was firm, but she caught a hint of worry in his eyes. "This land was secured by treaty. They can't just take it." Briggs cleared his throat, brushing snow from his coat sleeve. "The railroad's board of directors has rather specific requirements for proof of ownership. A properly filed deed, documentation of the treaty terms, registered survey markers." His thin smile didn't reach his eyes. "I'm sure you understand. We must follow proper legal procedures." "These mountains have been my family's home for generations," Samuel said, "long before your railroad decided it wanted them." "The railroad's patience is not unlimited, Mr. Greyhawk." Briggs straightened his coat. 60 days. I suggest you use them wisely." With a curt nod, he turned and disappeared into the swirling snow. After closing the door, Samuel crossed to a shelf near the wood stove. He pulled down a battered tin strongbox and set it on the table. The metal was scratched and dented, speaking of years of use. He opened it carefully, revealing a collection of folded papers, old letters, and documents. "The deed should be here," he said, sorting through the contents, "along with the treaty papers." But as he continued searching, his movements became more urgent. Something's missing. The most important documents, if they're not here. "Could they have been moved?" Lydia asked, watching his growing frustration. Samuel ran a hand through his dark hair. "After my mother died, there was trouble with some settlers trying to claim the land. I remember her telling me she hid some important papers. He closed the box with a sharp click. We'll need to search the cabin and outbuildings thoroughly, but it will have to wait for daylight. Morning arrived with a bitter wind that rattled the cabin's windows. Lydia woke to find Samuel already outside, the sound of his axe striking ice drawing her to the window. He worked steadily at the frozen water trough, breaking up the thick crust so the horses could drink. She busied herself organizing the kitchen, trying to make sense of the scattered supplies and worn cookware. The work helped keep her mind off her aching back and swollen feet. As she sorted through a cabinet, something caught her eye on the mantel, a small leather pouch decorated with intricate Apache beadwork. The designs were beautiful geometric patterns in deep blues and rich browns. The beads caught the morning light, and somehow Lydia knew this wasn't just a decorative piece. There was meaning in those careful stitches, history woven into every pattern. When Samuel came in for supper, bringing a blast of cold air with him, Lydia had managed to prepare a simple meal of beans and cornbread. They ate in comfortable silence until she finally gathered the courage to ask about the beaded pouch. "It was my mother's," Samuel said softly, his eyes distant with memory. "She made it the year the treaty was signed." He set down his spoon, shoulders heavy with the weight of the past. This valley was sacred to her people. When the first settlers came, there was fighting, raids, and reprisals that helped no one. Finally, the tribal elders agreed to meet with the territorial governor. He paused, staring into the fire through the wood stove's iron grate. They signed a treaty, promising this section of the mountains would remain Apache land forever. My mother was there. She didn't trust the government's promises, but she believed in the power of putting things in writing, making them official in the white man's way. Lydia thought of the missing papers, understanding now why they were so crucial. Without them, Samuel could lose everything: the land, the cabin, the security he'd tried to provide for her and her unborn child. The railroad would take it all, leaving them with nothing. "We'll find the papers," she said, surprising herself with the determination in her voice. "Tomorrow we'll search every corner of this place." Samuel looked at her for a long moment, then nodded. "Together," he said quietly, and Lydia felt the words settle between them like a promise. The days following Briggs's visit settled into a rhythm of constant work. The mountain winter demanded attention to 100 tasks, each one vital for survival. Samuel and Lydia faced them together, learning to move around each other in the close quarters of the cabin. One morning, as weak sunlight filtered through the frost-covered windows, Samuel wrestled with the barn's heavy door. The top hinge had worked loose, making the door drag and stick in the snow. Lydia watched from the doorway, wrapped in her shawl as he hammered the iron back into place. "Mind holding this steady?" he asked, and she stepped forward to grip the door's edge. Their hands brushed as she took position, and she noticed how he always managed to be gentle despite his strength. The barn work led naturally to checking on the cattle. Samuel's small herd needed extra hay to weather the cold snap. They worked side by side, pitching golden stalks from the stored bales. The physical labor warmed Lydia despite the chill, and she found herself appreciating the simple satisfaction of caring for animals. Later that afternoon, while Samuel chopped more firewood, Lydia discovered a torn harness hanging in the tack room. The leather was good, just separated at a crucial seam, having learned leather work from necessity on her father's farm. She gathered needle and waxed thread. Samuel found her there, bent over her work. "You know how to repair tack?" he asked, surprise evident in his voice. "Had to learn," she replied, not looking up from her careful stitches. "Father would never pay the saddler when things broke." The memory held old bitterness, but here, now, the skill felt like a victory instead of a burden. When she finished, Samuel examined her work with careful fingers. "Strong stitching," he said. "Thank you, Mrs. Greyhawk." The way he said her new name made her cheeks warm. The next day brought a new challenge. Samuel appeared with 2 pairs of snowshoes, the wooden frames latticed with rawhide webbing. "Need to check the stock pond," he explained. "Ice might need breaking." Lydia stared at the strange footwear. "I've never," "I'll teach you," he said simply, and spent the next hour showing her how to strap them on and walk without tangling her feet. She fell twice, but he helped her up without comment, steady hands ensuring she was stable before letting go. The journey to the pond took longer than normal walking would have, but Lydia found herself enjoying the strange floating sensation of gliding over the deep snow. Samuel moved ahead, breaking trail, occasionally glancing back to ensure she managed the steeper sections. A sudden thaw arrived 3 days later, turning the pristine white landscape into a mess of mud and slush. Samuel saw opportunity in the warmer weather. "Good time to check the root cellar," he said over breakfast. "Ground's soft enough to dig if we need to." The old cellar lay behind the cabin, its door half buried in the hillside. Together, they cleared away melting snow and pulled the heavy planks open. The earthen steps were slick with moisture, but Samuel's hand at her elbow kept Lydia steady as they descended. The underground room smelled of dirt and old potatoes. Samuel lit a lantern, revealing rough stone walls lined with shelves. They began methodically searching through boxes and crates, looking for any hidden papers. It was Lydia who found the oilcloth bundle, tucked behind a stack of empty preserve jars. Her fingers recognized the importance of it before her mind did, the careful wrapping, the way it had been deliberately placed. "Samuel?" she called softly, and he was beside her in 2 strides. Together, they unwrapped the package on a clear patch of shelf. Inside were letters, the paper yellowed but preserved by the oilcloth. Samuel's hands trembled slightly as he recognized his mother's flowing script. Beneath the letters lay a single page, different from the rest. The paper was heavier, official-looking, with carefully drawn boundaries and land descriptions. But where signatures should have been, the bottom remained blank. "It's part of the treaty," Samuel said, voice tight with emotion. "This page details the exact boundaries of the land grant." He traced the careful descriptions with one finger. "But without the signatures—" "Could it still help?" Lydia asked. "Even unsigned, it proves the treaty existed." "Maybe." Samuel carefully rewrapped the documents. "But showing this to Briggs would be risky. He could claim it's worthless without signatures. Or worse, call it a forgery." They were still discussing possibilities that evening when a knock at the door announced Eleanor Kavanaugh. The older woman bustled in with a basket of fresh eggs and a determined expression. "Thought you newlyweds could use these," she announced, setting the basket on the table. "And thought you should know. Railroad men have been asking questions in town. About you specifically, Samuel Greyhawk." Samuel's expression didn't change, but Lydia saw his shoulders tense. "What kind of questions?" "About your claim to this land, about your mother's people." Mrs. Kavanaugh settled herself by the fire, accepting the cup of tea Lydia offered. "They're building a case, if you ask me. Trying to find ways to discredit any proof you might have." The older woman stayed through 2 cups of tea, sharing what she'd overheard in town. When Samuel stepped out to check the horses before dark, she turned to Lydia with kind eyes. "You're good for him," she said simply. "I've known Samuel Greyhawk for years, never seen him so settled, even with all this trouble brewing." Lydia felt warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the tea. She'd noticed how Samuel had taken to introducing her as Mrs. Greyhawk whenever anyone visited. Each time he said it, the name felt more like her own, less like a hasty arrangement made in a snowstorm. When Mrs. Kavanaugh finally left, Samuel and Lydia stood together in the doorway, watching their neighbor's lantern bob away through the gathering dusk. The unsigned treaty page weighed heavy in both their thoughts, a fragile hope wrapped in oilcloth hidden away in the root cellar. The weather changed overnight, bringing fresh snow that fell in thick, silent curtains. By morning, drifts had sealed the cabin door, requiring Samuel to shoulder it open. The world outside had transformed into a white fortress, trapping them inside their small sanctuary. "Looks like we're staying put for a while," Samuel observed, bringing in an extra load of firewood. Snow clung to his shoulders, melting quickly in the warmth of the cabin. Lydia nodded, already considering how to fill the hours ahead. Her eyes fell on a stack of empty flour sacks she'd been saving. The fabric, though rough, was sturdy and clean. "These windows could use curtains," she said, running her fingers over the material. "The old ones are more patch than cloth." Samuel watched her gather her sewing supplies, needle, thread, and scissors she'd brought from Silver Hollow. "Make the place more of a home," he agreed quietly. While Lydia measured and cut the fabric, Samuel retrieved a piece of pine wood he'd been storing behind the stove to dry. He settled at the table with his carving tools, and soon the steady rhythm of their separate tasks filled the cabin. The whisper of thread pulling through fabric, the soft scrape of knife against wood. The afternoon light was gray and diffused through the falling snow when Lydia finally asked, "What are you making?" Samuel's hands stilled on the emerging curved shape. "A cradle," he answered, his voice low. "Thought the little one might need a proper place to sleep." Lydia's throat tightened with unexpected emotion. She looked down at her swollen belly, then back at the careful way Samuel's strong hands shaped the wood. The simple kindness of it made her eyes sting. The quiet between them felt safer now, and as evening approached, stories began to emerge. Lydia found herself speaking of her father, how the drink had taken him piece by piece, until the farm slipped away like water through cupped hands. "He wasn't always cruel," she said, her needle moving steadily through the hem of a curtain. "Just weak, the bottle made him mean, but mostly it made him useless." She paused, the memories bitter on her tongue. "After he died, Mother, she changed, got harder, like she'd been storing up all that anger and finally had someone weaker to turn it on." Samuel listened without interrupting, his hands steady on the cradle's emerging railings. When she fell silent, he shared his own story of joining the United States Cavalry as a scout, believing he could bridge two worlds. "They wanted me to lead them to a group of Apache families," he said, testing the smoothness of a carved post with his thumb. "Women, children, elders who'd fled the reservation because there wasn't enough food. The commander said they were hostiles, but I'd seen the reservation conditions. They were just hungry." His jaw tightened. "I resigned my commission that night. Couldn't be part of hunting my own people." The snow continued through the next day, but the enforced closeness no longer felt like confinement. They worked on their projects, shared meals, and slowly filled the space between them with understanding. Lydia hung the finished curtains, their simple dignity transforming the windows. Samuel's cradle took shape, each piece carved with careful attention. On the third morning, the storm finally broke. The sun emerged bright and cold, making the snow-covered landscape glitter like scattered diamonds. Samuel suggested checking the fence lines on the ridge above the cabin. "Fresh air would do us good," he said, helping Lydia mount up on his gentle sorrel. The gelding was sure-footed in the deep snow, following Samuel's sturdy bay mare up the slope. The view from the ridge stole Lydia's breath, endless waves of white-capped mountains rolling away to the horizon. The air was sharp and clean in her lungs, and for a moment, she felt the vastness of their freedom. Their peaceful mood shattered when they returned to the cabin. Samuel noticed it first, tracks in the snow made after the storm. Hoofprints circled the building, coming close to windows, lingering near doors. Someone had been watching while they were gone. "Inside," Samuel said quietly, his hand firm but gentle on Lydia's elbow as he helped her dismount. He took care of the horses quickly, then came in with his Winchester rifle. He checked that it was loaded, then propped it near the door. "I'll bring in extra wood," he said, his voice carefully steady, "just in case we need to stay in for a while." Lydia watched him stack split logs near the stove, her heart beating quick and uneven. The threat was nebulous but real, unseen eyes in the wilderness, unknown intentions in the tracks around their home. Yet somehow, the fear felt different from what she'd known before. This wasn't the helpless terror of her mother's house, or the sick dread of the saloon's back room. With Samuel's solid presence nearby, even fear felt manageable. She found herself trusting his calm preparation, his quiet strength. He didn't dismiss the danger, but neither did he let it overwhelm them. As darkness gathered outside, Lydia lit the lamps and hung the final curtain, a small act of defiance against whatever watched from the shadows. Samuel added wood to the stove, then checked the rifle one more time before sitting down to continue work on the cradle. The lamplight was warm on the fresh carved wood, and despite the tension, Lydia felt an unfamiliar sensation settle in her chest. It took her a moment to recognize it as belonging, not just to this place, but to the steady partnership they were building, stronger than the threat of unseen enemies. The morning dawned bright and cold, the recent snow packed hard enough for easy travel. Samuel suggested they make a supply run to Silver Hollow, while the weather held. Lydia agreed, knowing they needed more flour and coffee, though the thought of returning to town made her stomach twist. "We'll take both horses," Samuel said, helping her mount the sorrel. "Can carry more that way?" The ride was peaceful, sunlight sparkling off the snow-laden branches. As they approached town, Lydia sat straighter in the saddle. She was Mrs. Greyhawk now, not the desperate girl who'd been sold in a saloon's back room. The thought gave her strength. The mercantile's bell chimed as they entered. Several customers turned to stare, their whispers barely concealed behind raised hands. Lydia lifted her chin and walked steadily to the dry goods counter, her wedding ring catching the light. "Morning, Mrs. Greyhawk," the shopkeeper said, his tone carefully neutral. "What can I get for you today?" "2 sacks of flour," she replied clearly, "coffee beans, sugar, and lamp oil." She continued listing items while Samuel moved to the hardware section for nails and tools. A woman Lydia recognized from her wedding day, one of their hasty witnesses, openly studied her expanding belly before hurrying outside. Lydia focused on counting out coins from the leather purse Samuel had given her, refusing to let the scrutiny affect her. They were loading their purchases onto the horses when Reverend Dunlop approached, his kind face brightening. "Mr. and Mrs. Greyhawk, good to see you both well." "Reverend," Samuel acknowledged with a nod. "I trust married life is agreeing with you." The minister's eyes twinkled. "There's been quite a bit of speculation about your sudden union, some rather dramatic theories floating about." "I imagine so," Samuel said dryly. "Well, speculation makes for good entertainment during long winter evenings," Reverend Dunlop chuckled. "Though I tell anyone who asks that it was a proper ceremony with proper witnesses, even if it was expedited." Lydia appreciated his diplomatic handling of their unusual circumstances. "Thank you, Reverend." "God's blessings on you both," he said warmly before continuing down the street. Their next stop was the post office, a small building that also housed the county records. While Lydia waited with the horses, Samuel went inside to inquire about historical land documents that might help prove his claim. He emerged looking frustrated. "Everything's misplaced," he reported, his jaw tight. Said the filing systems being reorganized could take weeks to locate anything. "Convenient timing," Lydia observed quietly. "Very." Samuel's expression was grim. "Let's get some coffee before we head back." The cafe was warm and smelled of fresh-baked bread. They found a corner table, and Lydia gratefully sipped the hot coffee, letting it chase away the morning's chill. Samuel ordered them both bowls of stew, watching the other patrons with careful attention. "2 men at the counter," he murmured. "Been watching us since we came in." Lydia didn't turn to look. "Railroad men?" "Maybe. Don't recognize them." He finished his stew quickly. "We should start back." They were barely an hour out of town when Samuel tensed, hearing hoofbeats behind them. 2 riders on matching bay horses approached at a steady pace. Samuel guided their mounts to the side of the trail, letting the men pass. One tipped his hat with exaggerated politeness. "Afternoon, Greyhawk." His smile didn't reach his eyes. Both men wore expensive city clothes unsuited for mountain travel. They rode past without further comment, but Samuel's watchfulness increased. He kept glancing behind them, one hand never far from his rifle. "Friends of yours?" Lydia asked when the riders were out of earshot. "Never seen them before," Samuel replied, "but I'd bet good money they're railroad company men, making sure we know we're being watched." The rest of the ride home was tense, though the men didn't reappear. Samuel insisted on checking the cabin and outbuildings before allowing Lydia to dismount. Only when he was satisfied did they unload their supplies. That evening, as Lydia stored the dry goods, she felt a strong movement in her belly, different from the usual kicks and rolls. The sensation made her pause, one hand pressed against her side. Samuel noticed her stillness. "Everything all right?" Yes, just. She took a deep breath. The baby's moving differently. Lower. I think it might come sooner than we expected. Samuel's expression shifted from concern to determination. He immediately began rearranging the bedroom, moving the nearly finished cradle closer to the bed and gathering clean linens. Mrs. Kavanaugh said she'd help when the time comes, he said, his movements purposeful. I'll ride out tomorrow and make sure she knows to be ready, and I'll bring more firewood inside, keep it stacked high. Lydia watched him prepare, touched by his practical response to her news. No panic, no hesitation, just quiet readiness to face whatever came next. Even with railroad men watching their trails and her time drawing near, she felt oddly secure. Samuel paused in his work, meeting her eyes. We'll be ready, he promised. Whatever happens. Lydia nodded, one hand still resting on her belly where their child moved beneath her heart. Despite the threats circling their mountain home, she believed him. A week passed quickly, each day filled with preparation. The morning of the barn raising dawned clear and cold, frost glittering on the fence posts. Samuel had been up since before sunrise, stoking fires and preparing coffee for the expected workers. Lydia stood at the cabin door, watching the first wagons approach through the morning mist. Looks like the Kavanaughs are leading the way, Samuel said, coming to stand beside her. And there, my mother's people are coming up the East Trail. Lydia watched as both groups converged on their land, weathered farmers in worn work clothes from nearby homesteads, and Apache families from the reservation, their horses decorated with bright blankets. The sight made her throat tight with unexpected emotion. I wasn't sure anyone would come, she admitted softly. Samuel squeezed her shoulder. This valley has always brought people together. The lower pasture soon filled with voices and activity. Samuel moved easily between the groups, switching from English to Apache as needed, directing men to where support beams needed raising. Lydia found herself swept into the women's circle, where Mrs. Kavanaugh supervised the preparation of a midday meal. An elderly Apache woman approached Lydia, holding out a beautifully beaded cradle board. Her weathered face creased in a smile as she spoke in her native tongue. Samuel's cousin Sarah translated. She says this is for the little one, Sarah explained. It belonged to Samuel's mother. Lydia traced the intricate beadwork with trembling fingers. Thank you, she said, meeting the elder's eyes. Thank you so much. Though they didn't share a language, the woman's warm embrace needed no translation. Throughout the morning, more gifts appeared. Soft tanned deerskin blankets, tiny moccasins, bundles of dried herbs for after the birth. Each offering came with stories and wisdom, shared through patient translation. Lydia absorbed it all, feeling the threads of community weaving around her. The barn frame rose steadily against the sky. Samuel directed the work with quiet authority, respected by both communities. During a brief rest, Lydia watched him draw aside an Apache elder, a man she heard others call Running Bear. They spoke in low voices, Samuel showing him the treaty page they'd found in the root cellar. The elder's face grew serious as he studied the document. He spoke at length, gesturing toward the distant mountains. Sarah, passing by with coffee, paused to translate for Lydia. Uncle says the paper could prove Samuel's claim, she whispered. But revealing it now might bring trouble. Some people would rather burn the valley than see it proven Apache land. Running Bear pressed the paper back into Samuel's hands, adding something that made Samuel nod gravely. When he rejoined Lydia, his expression was thoughtful. He's right, Samuel said quietly. We need more than just paper to win this fight. By late afternoon, the barn's basic structure stood complete. Women laid out a feast on makeshift tables, steaming pots of stew, golden cornbread, pies made from preserved fruit. Lanterns were hung from the new rafters, their light catching the frost as darkness fell. The gathered community settled in to eat, Apache families and white settlers sharing benches, passing dishes back and forth. Children played together in the barn's shadows, while elders exchanged stories. Music started up, a fiddle from one corner, a drum from another, somehow blending into something new and beautiful. Lydia sat beside Samuel, watching it all. Here was her mother's worst fear. Different peoples sharing food and fellowship, their children playing together, the boundaries between communities softening in the lantern light. Yet it felt right, felt like hope. "Your mother would be proud," she told Samuel softly, "seeing all these people here together." His hand found hers, fingers intertwining. She always said this land was meant to bring people together, not divide them. As the evening deepened, families began loading wagons and mounting horses for home. Each departure brought good wishes for the baby and promises to return when needed. Running Bear pressed something into Samuel's hand, a small medicine pouch on a leather cord, speaking brief words of blessing. The last wagon disappeared into the darkness, leaving them alone with the newly raised barn standing stark against the star-filled sky. Samuel helped Lydia onto their horse for the short ride back to the cabin. "Thank you," she said as they rode, "for letting me be part of this." Samuel's arm tightened around her. "You are part of this," he said firmly. "Part of my family, my people, this land." His voice grew fierce with conviction. "No one will take you or the child from me, I swear it." Lydia leaned back against his chest, feeling the steady beat of his heart. For the first time since leaving Silver Hollow, she felt truly at home. Not just in the cabin or on the land, but in the space between worlds that Samuel had created, where people could come together and share their strength. The barn stood as proof of that strength, built by many hands working as one. Whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them the same way, together, drawing on the bonds of two communities now linked through love and common purpose. Winter settled deep into the valley, transforming their world into pristine white silence. Each morning brought new routines, as Lydia and Samuel fell into the steady rhythm of mountain life. Samuel rose before dawn to break ice in the water troughs and tend to the livestock huddled in the barn. Lydia kept the wood stove burning, preparing hearty meals to fortify them against the biting cold. Their days filled with necessary tasks. Samuel split logs until the woodpile grew tall enough to last through the deepest freezes. Lydia learned to bank the fire just right to keep warm through the night. Together, they carried hay to the cattle, their boots crunching across the frozen ground. As Christmas Eve approached, Lydia found herself humming while she worked. Her hands, chapped from washing, moved steadily as she kneaded bread dough. The baby kicked more these days, especially in the evenings. She'd taken to talking to it while she worked, sharing little observations about their life here. The afternoon light was fading when hoofbeats approached the cabin. Samuel tensed, reaching for his rifle, but relaxed when he recognized Reverend Dunlap's distinctive knock. "Merry Christmas!" the Reverend called as they opened the door. Snow dusted his shoulders, and his cheeks were red from the cold. He carried a small package wrapped in brown paper. "Come in, Reverend," Samuel welcomed him, taking his coat. "You rode all this way in the snow?" "Couldn't let Christmas pass without checking on my newest married couple." The Reverend's eyes twinkled as he handed Lydia the package. "A small gift, Mrs. Greyhawk." Lydia unwrapped it carefully to find a leather-bound Bible, small enough to fit in her apron pocket. Inside, the Reverend had inscribed a blessing for their family. She traced the words with her finger, touched by the thoughtfulness. "Thank you," she said softly. "It's perfect." Before the Reverend could respond, more voices called from outside. The Kavanaughs arrived in their wagon, followed by the Hendersons on horseback. Each family brought dishes covered in cloth, savory meat pies, sweet apple tarts, and Mrs. Kavanaugh's famous spice cake. The cabin filled with warmth and conversation. Someone produced a fiddle, and toe-tapping tunes mixed with laughter. Lydia found herself swept into the women's circle by the stove, where they shared advice about the coming baby between bites of pie. "You're carrying high," Mrs. Henderson observed. "Might be a boy." "Don't listen to her," Mrs. Kavanaugh chuckled. "My Sally carried the same way, and she gave me 3 granddaughters." Samuel moved among their guests, pouring coffee and sharing news of the valley. Lydia watched him, noting how naturally he played host. This was a side of him she hadn't expected, this quiet joy in having people gather under their roof. Outside, snow began to fall again, fat flakes drifting past the windows. The Reverend led them in singing carols, their voices rising to the cabin's rafters. Even Samuel joined in, his deep bass adding richness to the familiar tunes. As evening deepened, their guests began departing, leaving behind warm wishes and promises to return. Soon, only the Reverend remained, finishing a last cup of coffee by the fire. "You've made something special here," he told them, gesturing to the cabin's cozy interior. "A true home." After he left, Lydia and Samuel stood together before the hearth, watching the flames dance. Samuel's arm slipped around her waist, his hand resting where the baby kicked. "Our child will be born to warmth and welcome," he said quietly. "Not like—" He didn't finish, but Lydia knew he was thinking of his own divided heritage, of her own harsh upbringing. "Ours," she repeated, tears stinging her eyes at the simple word. Samuel had never before claimed the baby so directly. His hand tightened on her waist, and she leaned into his strength. They banked the fire for the night and retired to their bedroom, the cabin peaceful around them. Lydia fell asleep to the soft sound of falling snow, feeling more content than she had in years. The pounding on the door jolted them both awake. Samuel was on his feet instantly, reaching for his gun. "Greyhawk!" a voice called. "Sheriff Grady, open up!" Samuel met Lydia's frightened eyes. "Stay here," he said firmly, pulling on his boots. But Lydia followed him anyway, wrapping a shawl around her nightdress. The main room was dark except for dying embers in the stove. Samuel opened the door to find Sheriff Grady flanked by 3 deputies, all armed. "Samuel Greyhawk," the sheriff said formally. "You're under arrest for horse theft." "What?" Lydia stepped forward. "That's impossible." "Ma'am, step back," one of the deputies warned. Samuel stood very still. "What horses?" "3 head of railroad company stock," Sheriff Grady replied. "Reported missing 2 days ago. Tracks led to your land." "That's ridiculous." Samuel's voice was controlled, but Lydia could see the tension in his shoulders. "I haven't left the valley in a week." "We have witnesses!" The sheriff wouldn't meet his eyes. "I'm sorry, Samuel. You'll have to come with us." "At least let him dress properly," Lydia protested. "It's freezing out there." The sheriff nodded and Samuel went to put on warmer clothes. When he returned, one of the deputies produced handcuffs. "That's not necessary," Sheriff Grady said quietly. "Samuel will come peaceful, won't you?" "You know me better than this, Elias," Samuel said, using the sheriff's first name. But he put on his coat and stepped out into the snowy night. Lydia grabbed his arm. "Samuel, you can't—" "Take care of things here," he told her softly. "I'll sort this out." His eyes held hers for a moment longer. Then he turned and walked to the waiting horses. Lydia stood in the doorway, watching until the group disappeared into the swirling snow. The Christmas Eve joy that had filled the cabin just hours before seemed to evaporate, leaving only cold fear in its wake. She pressed one hand to her belly, feeling the baby move. "We'll get him back," she whispered, though her voice shook. "We have to." The night air bit cold as Samuel was led away from the cabin. Sheriff Grady kept his men moving at a steady pace through the deep snow, their horses' hooves breaking through the frozen crust. Samuel sat straight in his saddle despite the chill, saying nothing as they made their way down the mountain trail. Dawn was breaking when they reached Silver Hollow. The town stirred slowly to life, smoke rising from chimneys as early risers started their day. A few people stopped to stare as the group rode past, whispering behind gloved hands at the sight of Samuel Greyhawk in custody. At the jailhouse, Sheriff Grady dismissed his deputies and led Samuel inside alone. The small building smelled of wood smoke and coffee. A pot bubbled on the potbelly stove in the corner. "I don't like this any more than you do," Grady said as he unlocked the cell door. "But my hands are tied. The railroad foreman Matthews swears you took those horses." Samuel stepped into the cell, his expression unchanging. "You know I wouldn't steal horses, Elias, not with a pregnant wife at home." The sheriff's weathered face showed his discomfort. "The tracks led to your valley. Matthews had 2 men willing to swear to it." "Railroad men?" Samuel asked quietly. Grady wouldn't meet his eyes as he locked the cell. "Get some rest. We'll sort this out proper when the judge returns from Denver." Back at the cabin, Lydia forced herself to maintain routine despite her churning worry. The animals needed tending regardless of human troubles. She pulled on Samuel's spare coat and made her way to the barn, where the cattle greeted her with quiet lows. Her hands shook as she forked hay into the mangers, but she kept working. Samuel had shown her how to break the ice in the water troughs, how to check each animal's condition. The familiar tasks helped steady her mind, though every shadow made her jump, expecting more trouble. By afternoon, exhaustion dragged at her. The baby seemed especially active, as if sensing her distress. She sat heavily in Samuel's chair by the fire, one hand pressed to her side where tiny feet kicked. "What do I do?" she whispered to the quiet cabin. "How do I help him?" Her eyes fell on the new Bible, still wrapped in its brown paper. Reverend Dunlop's gift seemed to call to her. She opened it carefully, letting the pages fall where they would. The words that caught her eye spoke of courage and justice. Rising with a new purpose, Lydia retrieved the treaty page from its hiding place. She spread it on the table, studying the careful handwriting that detailed the agreement between Samuel's mother's people and the government. Though unsigned, the document clearly showed the valley had been promised as protected land. Night settled early, as it always did in winter. Lydia kept the lamps burning late, reading and rereading both Bible and treaty until her eyes burned. Sleep came in fitful bursts, broken by the baby's movement and her own racing thoughts. With the first gray light of morning, she knew what she had to do. She couldn't sit idle while Samuel sat in jail on false charges. The railroad thought they could bully them off their land by any means necessary. Well, they would learn that Samuel Greyhawk's wife was no coward. Moving with deliberate care, Lydia packed a basket with bread and cheese. She filled Samuel's old canteen with hot coffee and wrapped it in a wool sock to keep it warm. Every blanket she could spare went into a pile by the door. The mare in the barn nickered a greeting as Lydia led her out. Samuel had shown her how to harness the horse to their small sleigh, though her cold fingers fumbled with the buckles. She worked slowly, checking each strap twice as he had taught her. "Good girl," she murmured, stroking the mare's neck. "We've got important work today." Loading the blankets into the sleigh, Lydia wrapped herself in layers until she could barely move. The baby protested the tight binding, but she knew the cold would be dangerous without proper protection. She tucked the treaty page safely inside her coat, close to her heart. The sun was barely over the mountain when she clucked to the mare and set out. Snow had drifted deep in places, making the sleigh's runners creak with effort. Lydia kept the horse to a steady pace, knowing they couldn't risk a stumble on the treacherous trail. Wind whipped at her face as they descended, carrying stinging ice crystals. She pulled her scarf higher, thinking of Samuel in that cold cell. Her husband had risked everything to save her from a degrading fate. Now it was her turn to fight for him, for their home, for the future of their unborn child. The mare's breath steamed in the frigid air as they made their way carefully down the mountain. Lydia's hands grew numb despite her mittens, but she kept a firm grip on the reins. Every jolt of the sleigh reminded her of her condition, yet she pressed on. "The Lord is my strength and my shield," she recited from her morning's reading, letting the words carry her forward. "In Him my heart trusts." The town of Silver Hollow appeared through the morning haze, like a charcoal sketch against the white landscape. Smoke rose straight up in the still air, and she could hear the distant whistle of the morning train. Lydia straightened her back, ignoring the ache in her muscles. She had come to face down the railroad men who thought they could steal their land through lies and false charges. She might be heavy with child, might be just a farmer's daughter who was sold by her own mother, but she carried truth in her pocket and determination in her heart. The mare's hooves crunched through the crusty snow as they approached the town limits. Early risers stopped to stare at the heavily bundled woman driving a sleigh alone into Silver Hollow. Lydia kept her eyes forward, her chin high. She had not come this far to falter now. The railroad office sat in a red brick building at the end of Silver Hollow's main street. Lydia tied the mare to the hitching post, her fingers clumsy with cold as she secured the reins. Through the frosted windows, she could see several figures moving inside, including Aldous Briggs at his polished desk. Taking a deep breath, she touched the treaty page hidden inside her coat. The baby kicked, as if lending strength. She straightened her shoulders and climbed the 3 wooden steps to the door. A brass bell chimed as she entered. The warm air inside made her cheeks sting after the bitter cold. 4 men stood around Briggs's desk, including Tom Matthews, the railroad foreman who had accused Samuel. They turned to stare at her, conversation dying mid-sentence. "Mrs. Greyhawk," Briggs said smoothly, rising from his chair, "this is hardly the place for a woman in your condition." "This is exactly where I need to be." Lydia's voice came out stronger than she expected. She unbuttoned her coat and withdrew the treaty page, careful not to let her hands shake. "You claim my husband has no right to his land? I have proof that says otherwise." Briggs's smile didn't reach his eyes. "My dear, surely this can wait until—" "It will not wait." Lydia stepped forward and laid the document on his desk. "Read it." The other men crowded closer. Matthew snorted when he saw the paper. "Ain't even signed. Worthless." "Read it aloud," Lydia insisted. "Everyone should hear exactly what promises were made about that valley." Briggs picked up the page with 2 fingers, as if it might soil his hands. "This appears to be some sort of draft agreement. Unsigned documents hold no legal weight, as I'm sure your husband knows." The bell chimed again. Reverend Dunlop entered, stamping snow from his boots. "I heard Mrs. Greyhawk's sleigh had been seen in town. I thought I might be needed." "The Reverend should hear this too," Lydia said. "Please, Mr. Briggs, read the words." More townspeople were gathering outside the windows now, curious about the commotion. Briggs's jaw tightened, but he cleared his throat and began to read. "This treaty, made between the United States government and the Western Apache Band led by Rain Woman, grants in perpetuity the High Valley lands north of Silver Creek." He continued through the detailed description of boundaries and terms. Lydia watched his face as he read. Something flickered in his expression when he reached the final paragraph. Recognition and perhaps fear. "These lands shall remain the property of Rain Woman's people and their descendants, free from settler claims or government seizure. As I said, without signatures." "Sheriff Grady," Lydia called out, having seen him appear in the doorway. "Samuel gave you something to keep safe, didn't he?" The sheriff nodded slowly. He reached into his heavy coat and withdrew a sealed envelope, slightly crumpled from being carried. "He asked me to hold this in case anything happened to him." "Open it," Lydia said. "Please." The room fell silent as Grady broke the seal. He pulled out another document, this one yellowed with age, its corners soft from handling. His eyes widened as he scanned it. "It's the same treaty," he said, "but this one's signed, witnessed by government agents, including—" He looked up at Briggs. "Including you, Aldous, when you were just starting out as a clerk." Mutters rose from the growing crowd. Briggs's face had gone pale. "That's impossible. Those records were destroyed in the courthouse fire." "Samuel's mother kept her copy safe," Lydia said. She knew someday men would try to take what was promised to her people, what was promised to her son. Matthew stepped forward, his face red. "This is nonsense. That half-breed can't—" "That half-breed is my husband," Lydia cut in, her voice sharp as winter wind. "And he owns that land legally by treaty and by blood, the same blood that runs in the child I carry." Reverend Dunlop moved to stand beside her. "The treaty appears legitimate, Aldous. Your own signature proves you witnessed its signing." "You knew," Sheriff Grady said quietly. "You knew all along the Greyhawk claim was valid. That's why you tried to force them out with false charges." The crowd pressed closer to the windows, their angry voices carrying through the glass. Briggs tugged at his collar, sweat visible on his forehead despite the winter chill. I was under orders. The railroad needs that pass." "The railroad needs to honor its agreements," Reverend Dunlop said, "and you need to drop these ridiculous charges against Samuel Greyhawk." Sheriff Grady was already writing in his notebook. "I'll have him released within the hour, and I'll be sending a full report to the territorial governor about this attempt to steal land through false arrest." Briggs sank into his chair, his authority crumbling as quickly as spring snow. The other men stepped back from his desk, not wanting to be associated with his schemes. Lydia gathered both treaty documents carefully. Her legs felt weak with relief, but she kept her voice steady. I trust there will be no more questions about our right to that land. No, ma'am, Sheriff Grady answered before Briggs could speak. I'd say that matter's settled for good and all. Aldous Briggs stood up from his desk, adjusting his vest with trembling fingers. His usual smooth demeanor cracked as he tried one last desperate play. Now see here, he sputtered. There are proper channels, procedures that must be followed. We can't simply... We can and we will. Sheriff Grady cut him off. He turned to his deputy who had appeared in the doorway. Go unlock Greyhawk's cell, right now. Briggs's face reddened. The railroad company will not stand for this interference with... The railroad company, Reverend Dunlop interrupted firmly, will be very interested to learn how their agent attempted to steal legally deeded land through false imprisonment. The Reverend's normally gentle voice carried an edge of steel. I wonder how your superiors will react when they discover you knew about this treaty all along, Aldous. That you witnessed its signing yourself. The gathered townspeople pressed closer to the windows, their angry murmurs growing louder. Briggs glanced nervously at the hostile faces. I suggest, the Reverend continued, that you cease any further interference with the Greyhawk's property. I will personally ensure the territorial governor receives a full account of these events if you persist. Sheriff Grady nodded in agreement. Best take that advice, Aldous. You've caused enough trouble. Lydia clutched both treaty documents to her chest, her heart racing as she watched Briggs deflate before her eyes. Without another word, she turned and walked out of the railroad office, her steps quick despite her heavy pregnancy. The cold winter air hit her face as she emerged onto the wooden sidewalk. She barely noticed the supportive nods from townspeople as she made her way toward the jailhouse 3 buildings down. Snow had started falling again, fat white flakes drifting in the still air. The jail was a squat building of rough-hewn logs, its small barred windows dark against the weathered wood. Lydia's boots crunched in the fresh snow as she approached. Her breath came in quick bursts, forming clouds in the frigid air. She could hear movement inside, the scrape of metal on metal as keys turned in locks. The heavy door creaked open. Samuel stepped out into the pale winter daylight, ducking his head slightly under the low doorframe. He wore the same clothes he'd been arrested in, his coat still dusted with hay from the barn. His dark eyes found her immediately. Lydia, he breathed, crossing the space between them in 3 long strides. She moved into his arms without hesitation, pressing her face against the rough wool of his coat. His embrace was careful, mindful of her swollen belly, but his arms held her close and secure. She could feel his heart beating strong and steady against her cheek. Thank you, he murmured into her hair. The deputy said you brought proof, that you faced down Briggs himself. I couldn't let them take what's ours, she whispered back. Not our land, not our home. Samuel's hand came up to cradle the back of her head, his touch infinitely gentle. Our home, he repeated softly, and she heard all the meaning carried in those 2 simple words. The deputy emerged from the jailhouse carrying Samuel's gun belt and other personal items. Sheriff says you're free to go, Mr. Greyhawk. Your property's all here. Samuel kept one arm around Lydia as he accepted his belongings, checking that everything was accounted for. He buckled on his gun belt with practiced ease. Your mare's still hitched to the sleigh, Lydia told him. I drove in this morning. He nodded, and they walked together toward the hitching post, where the horse waited patiently, steam rising from her flanks in the cold air. Samuel helped Lydia up onto the seat first, tucking the heavy buffalo robe around her legs before climbing up beside her. The mare knew the way home, plodding steadily through the deepening snow. Samuel held the reins in one hand. His other hand found Lydia's beneath the buffalo robe, his fingers intertwining with hers. Neither spoke much as they left town behind, but the silence between them was comfortable, filled with unspoken understanding. The late afternoon sun broke briefly through the clouds, making the snow-covered landscape glitter. Their breath mingled in the cold air, as the sleigh runners cut smooth tracks through the fresh powder. Samuel's thumb traced small circles on the back of Lydia's hand, a gentle reminder of his presence and gratitude. They passed the creek crossing, then began the slow climb up toward their valley. The mare's hooves made a steady rhythm in the snow, carrying them home together, step by step through the gathering winter dusk. The morning after Samuel's return, neighbors began arriving at the ranch. Word had spread quickly about their victory over the railroad company, and the community showed up in force to demonstrate their support. Mrs. Kavanaugh was first, bringing a fresh-baked loaf of sourdough bread and her trademark determination to set things right. "Those railroad men never did have any sense," she declared, settling herself by the wood stove. "Trying to steal land from honest folk. Well, they got what was coming to them, didn't they?" More visitors followed throughout the day. The Hendersons brought eggs and butter, while the Wilsons arrived with a smoked ham. Each visitor offered congratulations and, more importantly, promises of help with spring planting and building projects. Samuel welcomed them all with quiet dignity, though Lydia could see the tension gradually easing from his shoulders as the day went on. The steady stream of support proved they had allies here, people who would stand with them against future threats. By late afternoon, the cabin was warm with hospitality and good spirits. Even Reverend Dunlop made the journey up from town, bringing news that Aldous Briggs had been recalled to the railroad's regional office to explain certain discrepancies. The following weeks brought signs of approaching spring. February's weather alternated between winter's last gasps and hints of warming days. Samuel noticed the change first, pointing out how water from melting snow trickled steadily into the stock pond, no longer freezing solid overnight. "The cattle will have good water soon," he said, standing with Lydia at the pond's edge, "and the grass will come back strong." Lydia rested her hands on her heavily swollen belly, feeling their child move within her. The baby had been especially active lately, as if sensing the changing season. Mrs. Kavanaugh, who checked on her regularly now, said this was a good sign. The labor pains began on a bright February morning, just as Samuel was heading out to check the fence lines. Lydia recognized the different quality of these contractions immediately. Sharper, more purposeful than the practice pains she'd felt before. "Samuel!" she called from the cabin doorway, one hand braced against the frame. "I think it's time." He turned back from the barn, took one look at her face, and strode quickly to the cabin. "I'll send for Mrs. Kavanaugh and the midwife," he said, helping her to the bedroom they'd prepared. Samuel's mare made quick work of fetching their helpers. Within an hour, both Mrs. Kavanaugh and Sarah Runningwater, the Apache midwife recommended by Samuel's relatives, arrived at the cabin. They took charge with the quiet efficiency of women who had guided many mothers through this journey. "You've got a good, strong baby here," Sarah said, her weathered hands gentle as she checked Lydia's belly. "He's positioned well. Now we wait." The hours stretched long. Samuel kept the fire stoked, bringing wood and fresh water whenever needed. He stayed close, though the women shooed him from the bedroom itself. Lydia could hear him pacing in the main room, his footsteps a steady counterpoint to her labor. Mrs. Kavanaugh wiped Lydia's forehead with a cool cloth. "You're doing fine, child, just fine. Every pain brings you closer to holding your little one." The sun crossed the sky and began to set, painting the cabin's walls with golden light. Lydia's world narrowed to the rhythm of contractions, the encouraging words of the two women supporting her, and the growing urge to push. "Now," Sarah said finally, her voice calm and sure. "The baby comes now." Lydia bore down with all her strength, dimly aware of Samuel's presence just outside the door. Mrs. Kavanaugh supported her shoulders while Sarah's skilled hands guided the baby's arrival. A thin cry pierced the evening air, their child's first breath and voice. Lydia fell back against the pillows, exhausted, but eager to see the baby Sarah was wrapping in a soft blanket. "A strong boy," Sarah announced, smiling, "with good lungs." "Samuel," Mrs. Kavanaugh called. "Come meet your son." He entered slowly, his usual confident stride gentled by the moment's importance. His eyes went first to Lydia, checking that she was well, before settling on the bundle Sarah held. Sarah placed the baby in Samuel's arms, showing him how to support the tiny head. Samuel cradled his son with infinite care, his large hands making the swaddled infant look even smaller. "This is my son," he said softly, wonder clear in his voice. He moved to sit beside Lydia on the bed, shifting so she could see their child's face. "This is our family." Lydia reached out to touch their baby's cheek, marveling at the perfect softness of his skin. The boy had Samuel's dark hair and what looked like her nose. His tiny fingers flexed as he yawned. Sarah stood at the foot of the bed and raised her hands. First in Apache, then in English, she offered the traditional blessing for a newborn. May you walk in beauty. May you grow strong and wise. May you know the love of family and the strength of two peoples joined as one. Mrs. Kavanaugh dabbed at her eyes with her apron. "Amen to that," she said firmly. "Now let's get this mother and baby comfortable while I fix up some healing tea." The women bustled about, changing linens and helping Lydia settle more comfortably. Through it all, Samuel kept hold of his son, seeming reluctant to let go even for a moment. His eyes held a fierce, protective love that made Lydia's heart swell. Outside, the February night was clear and cold, stars bright in the dark sky. Inside the cabin, warmth and joy filled every corner. Their son's soft breathing joined the familiar sounds of the fire crackling and the wind in the eaves. Lydia watched Samuel with their baby and knew that everything, the struggles, the fear, the uncertainty, had led them to this perfect moment. They were a family now, bound together by love stronger than any law or treaty. Their son would grow up knowing both his parents' heritage, learning the best of both worlds. He would know this land, this home they had fought to keep, and the story of how his parents found each other in the depths of winter. Spring arrived in gentle waves, melting snow and coaxing tender green shoots from the earth. The valley transformed day by day, winter's stark white giving way to vibrant new life. Wildflowers dotted the meadows, and fresh grass carpeted the slopes where Samuel's cattle grazed. On a bright morning, Samuel helped Lydia mount his sorrel gelding, carefully passing their sleeping son up to her. The baby, now 3 months old, was securely wrapped against her chest in a soft blanket. Samuel swung into the saddle behind them, and together they rode up to the ridge that overlooked their land. Below them, the valley spread out in all its spring glory. The railroad tracks glinted in the morning sun, curving away from their homestead in a gentle arc that preserved their property. Word had spread that Aldous Briggs had been recalled to the railroad's headquarters in shame, his schemes exposed. Peace had settled over the valley like a warm blanket. "It's beautiful," Lydia said softly, leaning back against Samuel's chest. The following Sunday, they dressed in their best clothes and took their son to the church. Reverend Dunlop beamed as he held the baby, performing the dedication ceremony with evident joy. The small church was packed. Townspeople filled the pews alongside Samuel's Apache relatives who had traveled from the reservation for the occasion. After the service, tables groaned under the weight of a community feast. Mrs. Kavanaugh's pies sat alongside traditional Apache dishes, and conversation flowed easily between all present. The baby was passed from arms to arms, blessed in 2 languages, and welcomed by both communities. As the sun began to set, they returned home to their cabin. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, carrying the scent of pine into the evening air. Inside, Lydia settled in her rocking chair beside the wood stove, their son cradled in her arms. She hummed a soft lullaby, one her grandmother had sung to her, while the cradle Samuel had carved rocked gently beneath her foot. Samuel stepped in from the porch, stopping in the doorway to take in the peaceful scene. A smile spread across his face as he watched his wife and son. They had weathered the winter's storms together, faced down threats and danger, and built something precious. Not just a homestead, but a true home worth defending. Thank you for being here. If something in this story stayed with you, I'd love to see you again. Subscribe. And tomorrow, I'll bring you another story crafted with heart.